Sleep paralysis, or night terrors as they are also commonly referred to, is a phenomenon where a person, or a subject, wakes up after going to sleep. Their eyes are open, they are awake, but their body is paralyzed. It's often hard to breathe. There's often a feeling of pressure on one's chest and the feeling of presences. More often than not, this phenomena also relates to the perception of entities. Most commonly, these are hags or shadow people. But as we'll see as we go throughout this video, things such as aliens are also not out of the question when it comes to sleep paralysis. The most common and the most popular image of sleep paralysis is the hag, pressed down and sitting on one's chest. And the word nightmare in the English language is actually directly related to a Celtic entity, a deity, if you will, that came to people in their sleep and did precisely that. It caused pressure on their chest and it sapped them of their energy. It scared them. It scared them so much that they couldn't move and they couldn't breathe and they couldn't scream for help. In this video, I'm going to be taking us through the history, the context, the science, and some of the perceptions involving sleep paralysis throughout the world and throughout time. My first encounter with sleep paralysis was when I was about 11 or 12 years old, and I remember that a friend of mine, also about the same age, was staying over at my house one night at a weekend, or perhaps it was a school holiday. Anyway, I woke in the middle of the night, very early hours of the morning, where it was still pitch black outside, and all I could see were the small LED lights from my television, clocks, stuff like that. I was on the top bunk of a set of bunk beds, and I could see this apparition standing in the doorway. Although it was completely black, when you know a room precisely and you've lived there pretty much your whole life, you can pick up on smaller intricacies which would let you know that someone's really standing there. There was also this sense of just this vile presence, something very horrible. My friend was on the bottom bunk, and I was very scared. I was petrified, and I tried to scream and reach out. I tried to get out my bed and call for my mum or something like that. But I couldn't move. I was stuck there, and I couldn't scream or make a sound. I remember thinking that I could hardly breathe, and the first thing that came into my head when it happened was that I was actually so scared that I had become petrified, that I was unable to move from the sheer fright alone. This apparition then walked further towards the bed, the lower bunk on which my friend was sleeping in. A couple years later, I started having these experiences a lot more frequently, and they would change a lot as well. No longer did I see what you would call shadow men or phantasmic figures and all the rest of it. I saw quite clearly and very vividly the form of an old woman who would sit on my chest and suffocate me and smile at me and laugh at me. And I felt I was being drained of everything that I had. I felt powerless and trapped. I felt, in a sense, that I was being spiritually raped. There was a real sense of perversion and stress to the whole scenario. The woman was naked, her body half decomposed, and these experiences started to really worry me. I didn't feel like I could talk to anyone else about it, as I just thought they were so strange and otherworldly that nobody would believe me, or there would be nothing else to say about it other than what I had thought and felt, and it would just be regarded as a dream. But little did I know that when I began to research this phenomenon, how deep it actually went throughout history, and how common it is, not only in our own society, but in all societies. And I started to see that this phenomenon may actually be so wide that it warrant being something almost innately human, or something ultimately anthropological, something that is not self-contained to individuals or specific cultures, but perhaps something that even animals may experience at times. Other symptoms of sleep paralysis can include strange odors or bodily sensations. Other sensory perceptions may be altered, such as the hearing or taste. It is not always that these experiences be accompanied by the sense of presence or entities, though it is very common. But sometimes your body can just remain in a state of paralysis and you're awake but can't move. It's very uncomfortable. It's normally quite frightening as well, but nonetheless, the rest of these symptoms or sensations are inconsistent with each other and vary from person to person. Though at the time of these experiences, for the individual that is going through them, they feel very much real. Even realer than a dream, and sometimes realer than waking. You can be very much pulled into one of these experiences and also feel that you may not be in entirely control of your thoughts during these. Over millennia, people have experienced and then conceptualized sleep paralysis to their own individual or culturally influenced standards. As it stands, this phenomenon is not fully explained by modern science, though it has made attempts at gathering data. Sleep deprivation, stress, or even simply being exposed to the idea of sleep paralysis are thought to be contributing factors. Yet sleep paralysis, or night terrors, can occur without any of these things. Throughout history, whether written down, passed through oral traditions, or just even in the contemporary spotlight of the present era, around the world this phenomenon has been recorded. Interestingly, the vast majority of accounts describe it as being spiritual or demonic, more specifically a type of ghost that would press down on the chest and constrict breathing. A lot of the time, such as is with the word nightmare, the entity or the phenomenon would be described by the name of the thing that was believed to be causing it. Although one could argue, much as the same as the spread of ideas in religion, that such an experience and tale could travel throughout the world and become more well known, but from the same source, much as like a language does or trends in art. This doesn't seem likely, as you can see on the screen right now. The amount of variances and the scope of this folklore, which is not derivative of each other. I mean, there will be a lot that obviously is derivative from one culture or one language or one word, are conceptualizations of what sleep paralysis is related to our understanding, whether we're in the UK or somewhere in America, or we're in Thailand, we're in Tibet, Vietnam, and your own pocket of time plays a massive role in how you would perceive this, whether you perceive it psychologically, whether you have a more scientific spin on it, whether you have a more spiritual spin on it, whether you believe it's paranormal, ghosts, introspective, something that's self-manifested, or something that comes from without. All of these are different, and therefore it seems that this phenomenon is not something that has been exchanged and shared and spread, and that is how it's become so prominent, but rather that it has happened to people independently around the world. And they have all tried to come up with their own ways of explaining it, due with the limited information that they had. For instance, as it is in Scotland, to go back for a moment to the origins of the word nightmare. In ancient Scotland, they believed that the nightmare was a natural force. They were pagan, a druidistic peoples. They had an almost animistic perspective over the world, where there was no simple material, that even a stone had elemental properties. It had an astral or a spiritual property to it. It had a symbol. The nightmare was no more mysterious a phenomenon to them as the weather, or the growing of trees and plants, and the birth of life after sex. They tried to conceptualize these things in accordance with the cultural framework that they had built and had been born and raised in and had available to them. If we go to the other side of the world, in Tibet, and look at what they think about sleep paralysis, we see that they believe, once again, an entity comes, it sits on one's chest, it presses down, it saps of energy. There's normally a sexual element to these stories, even if only subtle, of being drained, of being raped, of being trapped against your will and in a horrible state. But in Tibet it is believed that this is self-manifested, that this comes from a polluted inner spirit. And we can see that whether it's in Scotland or Tibet or anywhere else in the world, they have their cultural nuances interlinked into how they express this phenomenon, this experience. Tibet obviously being a Buddhist culture, it has its own metaphysics played out to it. The Celtic interpretation does not fit the Tibetan metaphysics and vice versa. So people are locked on how they view these universal experiences that happen, and the only way they can express it is through the subject, the interpretive qualities, and by which they are locked into from their culture. Ultimately, the various names, legends, and experiences related to this would become distinctly categorized in the face of growing religious and imperial powers. Once a language has taken hold, once the same powers or authorities have taken hold of a place, their influence spreads out. And in the case of Europe, this became remarkably so, where the idea of a succubus or an incubus became much more pronounced with the rise of Christianity and its vast spread across much of the world. Whilst in the ancient world, this experience was open to a lot more interpretation and an individual or a personal input. In the medieval time, especially in the West, you had people like demonologists coming into the scene. You had a developing religious sentiment, a metaphysics refining itself and expanding itself across multiple regions and territories. This in time, namely from the end of the first millennium to about the end of the Renaissance, it led to a distillation in the concept of sleep paralysis. Keep in mind that sleep paralysis is a modern conception. The only way to express this previously was mostly relating to spiritual entities themselves, and there was no way to really detach oneself, especially in the West, from the experience and to try and look at it impersonally. But the nuances, the different ways that people may have perceived what had happened to them and their neighbors had become a lot more official and spoon-fed. There were people who had great power, who genuinely thought they knew the answers and could work out how witchcraft worked, how demons worked, and this was all brought in to the Christian metaphysics to represent them as demons, to put different qualities onto them, to put the inherently sexual quality into them, to put the alternations between an incubi, which comes and absorbs the sexual energy of females, and the succubi, which comes and absorbs the sexual energy of males. Everything was becoming more clearly categorized, and you would be living in a time where if this happened to you, you would probably be extremely scared, because if you asked around, or perhaps you had already knew, or you had come across some readings of this, or you had come across this being spoken of, or a new folklore coming into light as time is going on, and you wouldn't really have much of a choice to see it any other way. Despite this growing uniformity in conceptions of the idea of sleep paralysis, or succubus as it was known in the time, contemporary experts and authorities were still often at odds, or had their own contentions within their groups as to how these beings functioned and what their purpose was, whether they were fully autonomous, or, as was sometimes speculated, the works of people practicing witchcraft. At times, these beings were believed to be the actual spirit of a practitioner of witchcraft that would transpose themselves, would have an outer body experience, would project themselves astrally, if you will, towards their victim, and would be the entity itself in a new form, perpetuating this abuse upon people. They took it very seriously. And some believed that they were no more than spirits that the witches were controlling. So even within this growing uniformity, even within this overarching institution, there are still discrepancies, and there are no full agreements on what it is. As the religious and political landscape evolved, as well as institutions and technology taking us into the modern world, so did the attitudes and beliefs start to change regarding sleep paralysis. And it was in this era, say, at the start of the 19th century to where we are now, that the terms sleep paralysis came into prominence. It is at this era where uh, belief started to become a lot more back open to interpretation. It was more inclined to discovery rather than there being a consensus that they were all some sort of demon or the source of witchcraft. And this was in part due to thinkers like Darwin, Freud, Blavatsky, Einstein. Big thinkers, not just big names obviously. There was economic shifts, there was vast political shifts with the rise of the United States and the French Revolution, the rise of communism and other social systems that were all starting to have a new metaphysic, a built-in ideology or a new form of existential thinking. And as is within the context of this video, we're seeing that it is by that you are locked to how you perceive sleep paralysis. But when old institutions have fallen down, or their words are no longer regarded as accurate or true, and it fades back into simply folklore or myth, and we have new visions of the world, then we are left with a wider variety of interpretations as to what it could be, just as we saw as was with the ancient world. On both sides of the materialistic and the spiritualistic divides, there was new information and theories coming to light. On the materialist side, they were contemplating, is it your diet? Is it to do with your psychological disposition, how you've been feeling? Is it perhaps due to something genetic, something in your brain, something chemical? Whilst on the spiritual side, they were coming into a lot more different texts from around the world. They were coming into a lot more established communication with different cultures. Books were a lot easier to get. And so they were exploring all sorts of different things. How to astrally project, the parameters of what is and how to obtain an outer body experience, karma, different religious viewpoints. And it was back in a realm where sleep paralysis had largely become a mystery again. Predominantly pre-decided for you, this unexplainable event by your culture or by your upbringing or your personal interpretation of reality. Sleep paralysis is one of these topics that touches a very thin boundary between the subject and object. For the way sleep paralysis is viewed is inextricably viewed with your interpretation or your view of what reality is. Much of the mystery at this time in history can be encapsulated in the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, who really speculated deeply and also wrote his own creative interpretation and his own personal mythos of what these creatures were. He even uses his own terms, so he calls them night gaunts at times. Though I do believe there were other beings and experiences that he based some of his work on during these episodes that he had. He was a writer who was very afraid of the unknown, and it points a finger at how much a thinker like he failed to really explain what it was, for he was genuinely horrified by it. During the 80s and 90s at Stanford University, a variety of tests and experiments were performed so as to better understand sleep as a whole, but particular attention was brought way to that of dreaming. In books such as Exploring the World of Lucid Dreaming from 1990 by Stephen LaBerge, sleep paralysis is said to be a failed response to ERM sleep, a natural state of deep sleep where eyes move rapidly behind closed eyelids, which is also when we are supposed to dream in our heads, and these visions are supposed to come to our minds. It is within REM sleep where dreaming occurs and where the boundaries of reality seem to adapt and shift. What we think as real, or what we experience essentially, is what we consider, at least in this state, to be a hallucination. It has also been observed that it is a natural response for the body whilst it is in REM sleep for it to paralyze itself. And this has been regarded as a sort of evolutionary adaptation of security for when we're sleeping. So that when we're asleep, we don't have our autonomous motor mechanisms running in the background and we start walking around, or we start talking, or we start doing things that we shouldn't be when we're resting. So when we're going to sleep, our body goes into a state of paralysis naturally. And the idea has become that within the mechanics of sleep paralysis, the brain is going into ERM sleep. It's going into deep sleep and it's beginning to dream. The body is becoming paralyzed, but somehow the subject is awakened. The person has woken up whilst their brainwaves are still going in the fashion of a dream. And so they experience a dream whilst in a half awakened state, and they experience it as real, just as you would experience that a dream is real. It follows in this theory that your reactions to being paralyzed, your reactions to not being able to move, naturally frightens you. And so you start to have a nightmare. It's not a good dream, it's not a positive vision, because you're stuck in this state, awakened. You are, in a sense, half in the waking state and half in the dreaming state. So your fear and your anxieties instantly manifest themselves. Now, of course, this doesn't really explain the majority of cases where there might be an entity present from the beginning. Though there could be psychological and there could be genetic influence as well going on in the background that enable a person to have these experiences. Buddhist schools, and such as with the modern teacher Chagyal Namkhai Norbo, who is a great teacher in dream yoga, he points to the realization that, in fact, all of reality is but an aspect of dreaming. And through pursuing dreams, particularly lucid dreaming, where you try to gain control over your dream, you learn about yourself and you learn about the real world as you're waking. And the key to this realization is to not see the distinction between the waking and the sleeping, and to realize how much power your mind actually has on what is around you and how much you manifest, just as you do within a dream, by your emotions, by your past experiences. And so there is a melding here of understanding reality in a new light. In the scientific sense, I've found data that seems reflective of these spiritual ideas as well. But before I go into the conclusion of this video, I'd like to first take a little detour into the realm of paranormal activity and sleep paralysis. This is where we are at in the social standing. For sleep paralysis has not just become about merely hags, it is far from it at this point. There are many entities which are almost exclusively seen in states of sleep paralysis or similar states to sleep paralysis, which seem almost completely new, but they are still shared. For instance, there is this idea of shadow people. Now, when I had heard this term, I knew instantly what they had meant because I had experienced it myself. You might recall in the story I told at the start about my first experiences with this, where I saw a dark, almost like a phantasm, a dark shadowy figure that didn't have a face, a body, or anything like that. And this is something that's become extremely prominent in experiencers of sleep paralysis. Where do these beings come from? Is it some sort of Jungian concept or mechanic in the collective unconscious? Are we transposing? Are we transforming ourselves and through different dimensions? Are we using our minds? Are we using our brain capacity to somehow transcend into alternate realities, into alternate perceptions? Is it possible that we could, in fact, be in touch with other entities operating on different wavelengths, if you will, of perception? Many alien abduction cases follow almost identically to those of previous sleep paralysis accounts before aliens were much known of. So, in a contemporary context, greys or other types of aliens are not uncommon in accounts of sleep paralysis. And likewise, some people have adapted sleep paralysis to be positive to them. Some people report being able to have outer body experiences very easily from a sleep paralysis point, and they can spend most of their night in full awareness walking around their house, seeing themselves sleep from afar, walk around their town. And some of the stories are quite remarkable. It seems that, at the very least, within this state of sleep paralysis, or perhaps at this point, it's really just the state of sleep, as we know, we are naturally paralyzed as we are sleeping. It seems that there is a lot of missing gaps in our information on what this means for us. And until this point, it seems that dreams are just regarded as nothing. That when you are awake, this is real, and when you are dreaming, whatever you experience then is not real. And where is the real reasoning behind that supposition? When we are awake, we are typically in a state in a brainwave pattern called beta waves. This oscillates on an EEG scanner at about 14 to 30 hertz. It is a typical awake or alert state within human beings when we are operating at this brainwave state. So when we are at beta waves, that is what we describe as reality per se. Now, when we go to delta waves or theta waves, we are in the realms of sleep and dreams where we see things differently. Now, what is different between one state and the next? When we're awakened, we have a different set of hormones in our body. We have less melatonin, for instance, and we're probably producing less indigenous DMT in this state as well. Uh, whilst alternatively, it's the other way round. When we're dreaming, we have a different chemical input in our body, and it gives us biological responses to that. Each one of them is determined by these chemical imbalances, or simply balances, really. And each one of them gives us a different sense of what reality is, and what we're perceiving, and what seems realistic and what doesn't. Almost everything is subject to these states, which can be viewed and observed through brainwave pattern. I'll put the pictures on the screen now for anyone to see what they look like. And I guess in some ways it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. I mean, what came first, the sense or the brainwave, you know what I mean? They are reflective of each other. It is showing us that when we're in a dream and when we're awake, we're still alive, we're still perceiving reality. We just have a difference in how that information is processed within our own minds and within our own brains. And given that, whilst the mystery of sleep paralysis remains largely unexplained, I feel that this is a real mind opener into getting into something far deeper than just that, into asking, how do we validate our realities? What is it that determines our outlooks on life and our dreams and our imaginations? And with that, I thank you all for listening so far, and I hope you enjoyed. I will see you again on the next episode.